Welcome. What's the view in Western capitals about the intense military face-off between the Indian and the Chinese armies? How will this bloody brutal military conflict impact the global geopolitical reality? Joining us for a special conversation is the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator of the Financial Times, Gideon Rachman. Gideon is widely tracked world over for his thoughts, his insights into what's happening in various world capitals. He is the author of the book Easternization, War and Peace in the Asian Century. The theme of the book is about Easternization, the shift in the global center of gravity from the west to the east. Mr. Rachman, welcome to India Today. I want to start by asking you about how, sitting where you are, you view the current military face-off between the Indian and the Chinese armies, in your sense of how the rest of the world is seeing this crisis.
Well, I think to me, it's a very dramatic moment in international politics, because if you look to the future of this century, India and China are the two emerging superpowers. I mean, arguably China's already there, but India's the other country with a population of over 1 billion people and nuclear-armed nation. Because of the trend that I wrote about in the book that you mentioned, this move of economic and political power towards Asia from the West, I think what happens in Asia is going to affect the whole world. So the sense that India and India have moved towards a much more adversarial relationship, a relationship which is on the brink of war, albeit I think they'll pull back now, is a very, very dramatic moment. And I think that, you say, how's it viewed in Western capitals? You have to be obviously aware that for most people, in Europe or the US at the moment, people are preoccupied by whatever, the coronavirus, the US election. But among policymakers, I think it's being watched extremely closely for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the United States itself has been moving towards a much more adversarial relationship with China for several years now. There's the trade war that Trump has initiated, also just a growing sense of strategic rivalry. And America has been attempting to, if you like, charm India into its camp. So I think the Americans are looking at this with intense interest and wondering if this will presage a big shift in India's view of their kind of relationship in this triangle between China, America, and the United States. But it's not just the Americans who are watching, because China has actually, over recent months, adopted a much more aggressive stance to a number of countries. India is the most dramatic example, because it's actually involved deaths. But you've seen them impose sanctions on Australia because the Australians had the temerity to suggest that there should be an independent international investigation into coronavirus. They're imprisoning the Canadians, who they've essentially taken hostage as part of this Huawei case. They've indulging in what they call kind of wolf warrior diplomacy, which is much more aggressive Chinese statements against anybody who says something they don't really like on coronavirus. And then in the more specific strategic issues in their immediate neighborhood, they're being more aggressive towards Taiwan, more assertive in the South China Sea. So there's a lot going on. And this India development is perhaps the most dramatic example of a wider pattern.
So let's get into a lot of what you touched one by one. You wrote a widely read column in the Financial Times where you argue that India picks a side in the new Cold War. You're essentially suggesting that after what happened between the Indian and Chinese armies, it's impossible for India and China to continue to have the kind of relation they did in the past, and India would gravitate towards the US. That's not completely the sense in India, which in the past has at least tried to have a policy of strategic autonomy, where they want to stay equally far away from both, do business with both sides, and yet remain independent in terms of what they did. Why is it that you feel that despite what the view in India may be, you think that India is more likely to come towards the US's strategic embrace? Gideon.
Well, I mean, obviously, events are very fresh, so we're all kind of interpreting as to how things might happen. But my sense is that this looks like it could be a defining moment, because it's the first time in 45 years that bloodshed has taken place between India and China. And, on my relatively infrequent visits to India over the years, I got the sense that, as you say, obviously India is very keen to maintain strategic autonomy, which makes perfect sense from the point of view of the Indian government. Why should you allow your foreign policy to be dictated by the priorities of anybody else? But also that, again, there's a series of competing viewpoints about what should be India's top priority in international relations. Should it be a view that's centered around the fact that we've had perpetual conflicts or successive conflicts with Pakistan? Is that the top priority? Should it be a view of India as a rising Asian power, which might see it as part of a kind of overall shift in power away from the West, which in a sense aligns India with what China is doing as a sort of reordering of the global kind of pecking order, if you like, economically and politically? Or should it be the threat of a rising China? And, in my conversations with Indian policymakers, different people are on different sides of the divide or have elements of each view. And my take was that I think that this clash will, as Indians assimilate it and interpret it, will elevate the China threat school in India. The people who say, actually, the biggest issue facing us is a rising China and the aggression of China will become more dominant in the debate, and that the conclusions that will come from that will lead India pretty inexorably towards a closer relationship with the United States. Now, of course, the US itself presents certain problems. The United States under Donald Trump is a country that is much less willing to help out its allies, and you've seen the whole issue with H-1B visas, which obviously affects India disproportionately just this week. But I think that Trump probably is looking like an aberrational president at the moment. He's well behind in the polls. And if you have a Joe Biden figure coming in as president of the United States, he has a much more traditional view of American alliances, and I think will go much further to try to woo India and to pull India into the US camp. And I suspect that he may get much more of a receptive audience in New Delhi after what's happened.
Since you focus so much on China's rise, I'm curious to know your thoughts on why China, in the middle of a global pandemic, has opened so many fronts. When Xi Jinping is already under international flak and scrutiny, we've seen pressure on Australia, we've seen pressure in the South China Sea, we've seen skirmishes and a lot of back and forth with Japan, with Taiwan. We're seeing new security laws in Hong Kong. So why is it that in the middle of a huge global crisis, in your view, has China opened so many fronts simultaneously?
Well, that's a great question, and of course, because China's a fairly closed society, it's hard to be sure. But I think there are a couple of plausible ways of looking at it. One is that if you go back to the beginning of this crisis in January, December, it had the possibility of building into a domestic political crisis for Xi Jinping. And whatever his priorities, priority number one is keeping himself in power and keeping the Communist Party in power. And you had, at the time, you remember the incident of the doctor in Wuhan who died so tragically and whose last words were about really essentially pointing the finger at the Chinese system, saying a system in which only one voice and one interpretation is heard is not a healthy system. And there was a big outpouring of emotion on the Chinese internet aimed at the government and aimed at its mishandling of this and the harassing of doctors and dissidents who had complained or tried to draw attention to what was happening in Wuhan. And that was a very dangerous moment for Xi Jinping. So I think that in domestic terms, it kind of made sense for him to start trying to focus some of that anger, some of that emotion outwards, and to say, look, the outside world is unfairly blaming this on China, to begin to float ideas without much foundation that maybe this disease did not originate in China, maybe it was imported by the Americans, getting those kinds of conspiracy theories going, and then to say, look, China is being unfairly picked on by the likes of Australia, the United States, and so on. And that then deflects attention outwards. And then I think that, another thing that's possible, I wouldn't want to put it stronger than that, is that the Chinese government has a number of strategic objectives in Asia, and you ticked off a number of the areas where they're being more aggressive, from Hong Kong to Taiwan and now the Indian border. And they may feel that a outside world that is grappling with a global health emergency plus the massive economic downturn that goes with that, is much less likely to respond because it's got so many other problems. The US also now has a presidential election, the whole furore around Black Lives Matter, it's in turmoil. And so the chances of America mustering the concentration to respond to this variety of Chinese challenges and to rally international support are lessened. So maybe the government in Beijing feels, okay, now's the time where we can really be more aggressive on a number of fronts and to create facts on the ground, facts in the water, facts in Hong Kong, and get away with it.
For a long time, the view inside China was that, bide your time, hide your strength, get done what needs to be done. And they had a longer view towards trying to emerge as a global power in the middle of the 21st century. Do you think this pandemic or the current thinking in the Communist Party in China makes them feel that their time has come and therefore you no longer need to bide your time or hide your strength? This is your time, and therefore flex your muscles and show your strength?
I think there is an element of that. I mean, I actually think that they moved away from that policy, which some policymakers refer to kind of in shorthand as hide and bide. Some time ago, you could date it to some extent after the financial crisis of 2008. I remember being in Beijing quite a lot around that time, and you did hear a lot from the Chinese saying, look, the whole prestige of American global leadership has been massively damaged. The Americans needed China to help reflate the global economy. So there was a surge of nationalism around then. And then again, I think it's strengthened when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, 2013. He gets 3 important jobs: General Secretary of the party, leader of the military, president of the country. And he is a new sort of leader. It's much more personalized rather than Hu Jintao, who presented himself as kind of the public face of the collective leadership, and much more assertive in its rhetoric and action. Xi makes his great pitch to China and to the world, this idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And although the kind of official pronouncements are still sometimes couched fairly modestly, if you talk to Chinese officials and intellectuals, there was a much more explicit willingness to say, yes, China does aspire to be the dominant power in Asia and maybe even in the world. And I think you began to see that reflected in aggressive foreign policy actions. And perhaps the most important that happened even during the Obama years was this decision to start building military bases right across the new South China Sea, to do dredging exercises and then to convert them into bases for the Navy and for the Air Force. And this was something that China did in a very bold manner and got away with without, America didn't really know how to respond. They stepped up naval exercises in the South China Sea, but nonetheless, China had created these facts in the water. And I think that kind of stuff had already been happening under Xi Jinping. And then you have the pandemic, which incidentally coincides with a blow to China in Taiwan in January, the re-election of President Tsai Ing-wen, who's regarded in Beijing as a sworn enemy, as an advocate of independence, and so on. So that led to a kind of step up in aggressive rhetoric aimed at Taiwan. But then, as we were discussing, the coronavirus presents Xi Jinping both with a domestic crisis and potentially an international opportunity. And I think you're seeing a more aggressive Chinese policy develop, stepping up for the kind of more assertive policies that you'd already seen in the Xi years. And it may also be that the Chinese feel that they have less to lose because the United States has moved towards a more confrontational policy. They had the trade wars and so on. And it looked like at the end of last year, Trump's game plan was to maybe get a trade deal with China and to present it as the fruits of his more confrontational policy and to run on that during the presidential election. However, Trump's strategy has changed because of the coronavirus. He's now clearly planning to run against China. It's talked about the Kung flu or the Wuhan virus, all of that. And so the Chinese may feel, well, look, we're not going to have a reconciliation, a trade deal with America, so we have less to lose ourselves.
You're suggesting that the thinking in China is that they may have less to lose, but if there is simultaneous confrontation with the likes of India, with the likes of the United States, with Australia, which have been key trading partners of Beijing, then how does China intend to fuel its future growth? Because key, as you said, to Xi Jinping's existence is internal stability. The moment, in any case, we're seeing in India, consumers starting to spurn Chinese products. In America, we're seeing a backlash. Global value chains are being reordered. Whether they come to India or they go elsewhere, that's a different matter, but at least an effort is being made to try and reduce dependence on China. So if every country starts pushing in that direction, how is it a less concern, in your view, to Beijing?
Yeah, no, I think they miscalculated. I mean, I was just trying to sort of, in a sense, put myself in their shoes and think, well, why have they done these seemingly string of reckless acts? And you can find an explanation, but I tend to agree with you. I think they have made a mistake. And I was struck that, you mentioned the column that I wrote for the FT this week, saying, that India was now going to be more closely aligned with the US in what some are calling a new Cold War. That there was a reply actually in the Global Times, which is a premier sort of nationalist newspaper in Beijing, saying it wasn't actually that confrontational. It just said that Mr. Rachman's made a mistake. There's no way that India will align itself with China because India will align itself with America because America is such an unreliable partner. But it made me think that maybe there is concern in Beijing as well that they've misstepped. And I do think that both in strategic and economic terms, they have a lot to lose because we are seeing much more questioning of the centering of manufacturing production in China. The fact that basically the Apple iPhone is made there, but so many other products, the world's electronic goods are essentially come out of southern China. And people are questioning that. They're questioning it around, in specific pandemic-related ways, around the production of medical equipment, personal protective equipment in China. But more broadly, I think there's a sense that do we really want to be that dependent on a country that is, as they've just shown with Australia, prepared to use trade as an instrument in a political dispute. Now, of course, they would say, well, the Americans do that all the time, and maybe that is true. But nonetheless, I think that countries are increasingly wary of becoming over-dependent on China. And it's not just the question of manufacturing in China. I think the other big ambition that they have that is now at risk is that China's got to the stage now where it has global companies and a lot of capital to deploy. And those companies were looking to expand around the world. And the emblematic one is Huawei, the telecoms firm, which is very advanced in 5G. And I know India's having its own debate about how much Huawei should be allowed to develop 5G in India. But this has been a debate all around the world. America essentially has shut Huawei out and was trying to persuade its allies not to allow Huawei in, but with limited success. Australia had followed the American line, but my own country, the UK, had allowed Huawei a substantial chunk of the 5G market.
But there seems to be a rethink on that now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that rethink was happening anyway, but now if the UK looks around the world and sees China performing all these different aggressive acts, it's going to be much harder to accept Huawei. And I remember, again, my last trip to China was in January, and talking to Chinese interlocutors about this, and they were both surprised and delighted by what seemed to be Britain's decision back then to allow Huawei in. And I think they're now going to lose that. The British decision is still up in the air, but my sense is that Huawei's role is going to be further restricted. And the British are also talking about trying to organize a group of democratic nations, perhaps including India, to develop a consortium that will develop its own 5G. And I think that kind of initiative is going to get much more attention now.
China has picked fights simultaneously with India, with the United States, with Australia, and over renaming of islands with Japan. These are also the countries of the Quad. Do you see the Quad deepening its engagement? Does this Quad provide some kind of a solid, tangible counterbalance to China? And how do you see the Quad emerge? Given the internal pulls and pressures in every country, what's your sense of the evolution of the Quad over the next few years?
Well, you've probably got a closer view of it than me, but I think the Quad is going to become more of a thing. I was very struck, actually, the last time I was in Delhi, having been just before to Australia, where they're very keen on the Quad. I was talking to a senior Indian official, and I said, I referred to Australia as a member of the Quad, and this person said to me, "Really, is Australia a member of the Quad?" At that point, they were still quite angry with the Australians over, ancient history, going back to the Kevin Rudd period. And so it seemed to me there was more reluctance in New Delhi about making the Quad a big thing than there was certainly in Washington or Canberra or Tokyo. But I suspect, but you're closer to it than me, that perhaps some of that Indian reticence will now go, and that the Quad will develop into something that is much more explicit, with fewer reservations, that does more regular exercises together. And I think they may also seek to develop ties with European navies to get, the British have these 2 aircraft carriers now, the French, etc. There's some debate in Europe as to whether we should begin to associate ourselves with, say, freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea in a more systematic way. And you've seen the French, for example, beginning to develop naval bases out in the Gulf area with a view to maybe shifting some resources towards Asia. Now, they're not big players compared to, obviously, the United States, but it helps to create the sense that there is a kind of global interest in what's going on out in Asia.
What's your reading of what will happen over the next few months in the United States? We've seen already from President Trump 2 declarations of intent in trying to help India in this battle against China. In some senses, it suits him because it helps him pull India closer. And yet, at the same time, there's concern in India, for example, on an issue which is very important to Indian techies like the H-1B visa, the United States wanting to turn the tap shut. And therefore, there is no guarantee about how predictable and reliable the United States would be as a genuine all-weather friend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there are no guarantees with Donald Trump at all. As an American analyst once put it to me, the thing about Trump is he'll be your best friend one day and he'll betray you the next day, and he won't even know he's betrayed you. And I think the H-1B thing is a very good example of that. He may not even have factored in what a blow that is and what an insult that is to India and so on. But I think if Trump goes, and you look at the opinion polls at the moment, for the first time he's really quite far behind, and the bookmakers are making Biden favorite. One can't make firm predictions, obviously, it's months away, but I think that a Biden presidency, or frankly an anyone else presidency, would be much more consistent and much more strategic, and would look at the relationship with India in the round and would say, we can't be so hot and cold. If we're going to make an investment in the relationship with this country, we have to be more consistent. And I would suspect that Biden would certainly do that. In fact, Biden's probably, of the Democrats who could have emerged, the one who is most traditional in his attitude to America's global role as, self-styled world policeman, his belief in American allies and the importance of American alliances. So I think a Biden presidency...
You're almost making it seem as if Biden's a shoo-in in November. We saw what happened the last time, and we've also seen in the past, whenever there have been racial tensions, it's the conservative leaders who typically tend to do well in elections soon after racial strife in the United States.
Oh, yeah. No, you make a very solid point. Look, I mean, I agree with you that I think some of this culture war stuff has to help Trump. I'm just looking at the opinion polls, and that they weren't a total guide last time, but at that time Hillary Clinton was like 3 points ahead. At the moment, Biden's 8 to 10 points ahead. But totally right. One can't be sure that Trump will win. But for the first time this week, I've begun to discount my skepticism and think, you know what? Actually, I do think he's going to lose. The combination of a terrible economy, social turmoil, and just general erratic behavior, and the opinion polls make me think Biden will win, but, we'll see.
What's your sense of what will happen next? If you were to look into your crystal ball and suggest whether it's in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and with India, where do you think China's aggression is going next?
Well, I mean, I think the thing about it is that they are a bit unpredictable. I mean, I wouldn't have 2 weeks ago said the Indian border, although you guys sitting closer to it would have been much more aware of the build-up of tensions. But the one I've been worried about really since the beginning of the year is Taiwan, because I think it's a much more touchstone issue for the Chinese people. It's something that is absolutely drilled into the average Chinese citizen through, the government's propaganda, social media, that Taiwan is almost a symbol of the revival of China, their nationhood. The elections were a big blow. China, the People's Republic of China, is becoming more threatening towards Taiwan. And I think, if there's currently a risk-taking mentality in Beijing, and if they think, in the end, America, particularly Trump's America, in the middle of an election, is not going to get involved in fighting in the South China Sea or around Taiwan, they may be a danger that they will do something really quite risky. Perhaps not an attack on Taiwan itself, but Taiwan, there are little islands that are currently claimed by and occupied by Taiwan. And maybe China would make a move against those, but obviously they're not in the habit of telling me what they're about to do. So we'll see.
And there is a military defense pact with the United States. Will the US live up to that pact, come to Taiwan's defense, or will they let those islands fall? Those will be important questions to track.
Huge questions, absolutely. And of course, like a lot of these military defense pacts, they're quite ambiguous. It's not written in stone or blood that in any event America will come to Taiwan's defense. That is the sort of understanding. But the US-Taiwan Relations Act is a little bit more ambiguous than that. So if the Americans wanted to get out of it, they would be able to find a way to do that.
And he's pulling out of the WTO. He's pulling back on the United Nations. There's no guarantee he'll step up to defend Taiwan if it came to that. But that is going to be something to look out for. Gideon Rachman, you've shared some very insightful thoughts on your reading of the current tensions between India and China and the impact this has on global geopolitics. I deeply appreciate your time. Thank you very much for speaking to our viewers on India Today. Thank you.
A pleasure.
That's Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator. Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.